All right, Dostoevsky, ready to tackle him. You guys sent in excerpts analyzing Poor Folk, his first novel, right?
Yep, first one. And even in this early work, you can see the seeds of his later masterpieces. It's incredible.
It really makes you question those assumptions about simple stories. Because Poor Folk is deceptively layered. This deep dive is kind of like a two-part mission, right?
Okay, I like that. Lay it on me.
So first, we got to figure out how this story, about ordinary people in St. Petersburg, how does it connect to those big philosophical novels he's known for?
Ah, so we're tracing the evolution of Dostoevsky's thought. Love it.
Exactly. And then the second part. We'll see how he tackles huge themes, even in this early work. Social injustice, the meaning of life, you name it.
The big questions right off the bat. Classic Dostoevsky.
Okay, let's start with the novel's form. Letters, right? It's called epistolary form. A little old-fashioned, even for 1845. Why do you think he chose that?
Well, back then, letters were usually for the elite, right? Fancy stationery, all that. But by using it for poor folk, Dostoevsky elevates their voices.
It's like he's saying their experiences matter just as much as anyone else's. Direct line to the reader.
Exactly. And it fits with his love for dialogue, letting characters speak for themselves. Even in his later novels, the narrator fades away. It's all about the characters' voices.
Makes him a dramatic writer, some say. So how did Poor Folk land when it came out? Did it make a splash?
Big splash. It was this time in the natural school. Realism was taking off.
Yeah.
But they mostly did short pieces, sketches of poverty.
Poor Folk was a full-fledged novel, right? Took that realism and ran with it.
Exactly. People were calling him the new Gogol.
Gogol, the overcoat, right. Another story about a lowly clerk. Was Dostoevsky just copying him, though?
Good question. Yeah, there are parallels. Both Poor Folk and The Overcoat have those downtrodden clerk protagonists. But Dostoevsky went deeper.
Beyond the surface, into their minds.
Exactly. Gogol showed the absurdity of their situation, but Dostoevsky wanted to explore their psychology. Like Makar Devushkin, the main character in Poor Folk. He's a copy clerk, like Akaky Akakiyevich, but he's also super self-aware.
He doesn't just suffer, he analyzes his suffering.
Exactly. He articulates it, which makes it even more poignant for the reader. We're right there with him, in his head.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So who is this Makar Devushkin? What makes him tick?
Picture this. A middle-aged guy, hunched over his desk, endlessly copying. That's Devushkin. But here's the twist. He's madly in love.
With Varvara Dobrsilova, and the age difference is a problem,
A
right?
huge problem. He's older, she's young, socially unacceptable back then. But his feelings are intense, and knowing it's impossible, well, that just adds to the tragedy.
Already sounds heartbreaking. So how does this impossible love play out?
Now, this is where Dostoevsky flips the script. Remember the overcoat. Akagi gets a new coat, brief moment of joy, material possession. But in Poor Folk, love is Devushkin's downfall. He sacrifices everything for Varvara. Money, well-being, even his dignity.
He becomes poor to help her. That doesn't make sense.
Right, but that's Dostoevsky. He shows us the messiness of human emotions. Love for Devushkin is both joy and suffering. This double-edged sword reveals his capacity for selflessness, but also the depths of his despair.
Powerful stuff. So it's this intense love story, but it's also set against the backdrop of poverty in St. Petersburg. Does Dostoevsky give us glimpses beyond Devushkin's perspective?
Oh yeah, you meet others who are struggling. Like the Gorshkov family, their story just hints at the hardships so many faced. And Varvara's backstory, revealed through her diary, it hints at some dark stuff. Exploitation, maybe abuse, even in a respectable household.
Wait, what happened to Varvara? Wasn't there a landowner involved?
Right, Bykov. Dostoevsky doesn't spell it out, but the clues are there. Varvara, orphaned, taken in by a relative. Bykov, this friend of the family, well, he took advantage of her.
That's awful. It feels like Dostoevsky's using these characters, these situations, to paint a bigger picture of Russian society, right?
You got it. He's showing that these individual struggles, these instances of suffering, they're not isolated. They're symptoms of a deeper social illness.
Okay, so this leads us to the rebellion theme. Devushkin starts to question the social order. How does that unfold?
Well, remember his self-awareness. He goes on this journey. At first, he accepts his low status as the way it is, but then hardship, witnessing other suffering, it makes him question the fairness. He sees that huge gap between rich and poor and starts wondering, why.
Like a social awakening.
Exactly. And there's this powerful scene. He walks from the poor streets along the canal to the Nevsky Prospect, all fancy and luxurious, total contrast. And it's like something clicks.
He sees the rich in their carriages, oblivious to the suffering.
He just lets loose, criticizes them, Bold move for a guy in his position.
So he actually speaks out against the rich.
He does. And it shows Dostoevsky engaging with the ideas of his time, like Henri de Saint-Saëns, the socialist thinker. He believed work, not inherited wealth, was the basis of morality. Devushkin's outburst echoes that.
Radical for 1845. But he feels guilty about it too, right? Torn between rebellion and conformity.
That's the brilliance. Dostoevsky captures that inner conflict. Devushkin wants to rebel, to scream against injustice, but he's afraid, conditioned to accept his place, even internalize this idea that poverty's his fault.
Not just external structures, but the internal impact they have, how deeply ingrained those beliefs about wealth and poverty become.
Exactly. And that struggle, rebellion versus conformity, it's a recurring theme in Dostoevsky's work. His characters are always battling those contradictory impulses.
This is blowing my mind already. Okay, so social injustice, internal struggle, impossible love. What other big themes are we dealing with here?
Well, there's charity. What it means to truly help others. Devushkin's so poor he can't even give alms. But he's also critical of the wealthy who ignore suffering, accuses them of hypocrisy, failing to live up to Christian ideals.
Connecting back to those socialist ideas, right? Applying Christian morality to society.
Yep. New Christianity was a big idea at the time. Dostoevsky explores it through his characters. True charity isn't just throwing coins at beggars. It's about recognizing everyone's inherent dignity.
I'm seeing how this simple story becomes a critique of the whole social order. But there's also that scene with Devushkin and the general, right?
Crucial scene. Shows the power of human connection. Devushkin's terrified of the general, expects to be scolded, but the general's surprisingly kind.
Gives him money. That'd be huge for Devushkin.
It is. But what really gets to him, the general shakes his hand. Back then, a handshake was a symbol of equality. Rarely happened between classes like that.
Wow. Simple act of acknowledging someone's humanity. More powerful than money, maybe.
Exactly. It's about dignity and respect, something Devushkin craves, but rarely gets.
Man, so much going on here. We haven't even touched on literature in the story. The Pushkin parallels or Devushkin questioning God. That's heavy stuff for a first novel.
Heavy indeed. But it shows you the depths Dostoevsky was already exploring.
So, ready to dive into part 2 of this deep dive?
Let's do it. Still so much to unpack.
Okay, back to Dostoevsky. Poor folk. Last time, Charity, that moving scene with the general. But before we go full-on existential crisis with Devushkin and... God, what about literature in this novel? Seems like books and writing are everywhere.
Yeah, Dostoevsky loved weaving those elements in. Not just telling a story, but commenting on storytelling itself.
Give me some examples. How does he do that?
Well, look at Rataziev, that struggling writer in Devushkin's building. At first, Devushkin's a huge fan.
Total fanboy, gushing over his work.
Exactly. And Dostoevsky uses that to parody the writing styles of the time. Those super sentimental romances, all idealized love and life.
So it's contrasting those fake romances with Devushkin's gritty reality. Life's not a fairy tale, especially if you're poor.
Precisely. He makes it confront the limits of those idealized stories like, hey, look at the real world. Poverty, suffering, it's complicated.
Okay, that makes sense. But then Devushkin gets upset after reading Gogol's The Overcoat.
Why? Interesting moment, right? Devushkin feels mocked, like Gogol's exposing his vulnerabilities. Worried society will look down on him even more now.
You know, I get that. I once read a book where a character from my background was portrayed, I don't know, kind of exploitatively. Made me uncomfortable. Like, my experiences were just entertainment.
That's insightful. And I think that's what Dostoevsky's doing here, exploring those power dynamics in storytelling. Who gets to tell the story? Who's the subject? And how do those stories shape how we see ourselves and others?
Deep stuff. Makes you think about the responsibility of telling stories, especially about vulnerable people.
For sure. And it highlights the need to read critically. Question the motives behind stories. Whose voices are being heard and whose are being silenced.
Okay, so we've got these layers of storytelling, stories within the story. But what about Pushkin's The Station Master? The text mentioned that as a key reference.
Pushkin. That's where Dostoevsky's literary game is strong. That story, a father loses his daughter, it wrecks him. And as Devushkin reads it, well, it triggers this intense fear of losing Varvara.
Foreshadowing. We know Varvara is thinking of marrying Bykov, the guy who took advantage of her. And Devushkin's terrified of being alone.
Exactly. Dostoevsky subtly hints at the tragedy coming, using that literary parallel to deepen our understanding of Devushkin's emotions, that sense of impending doom.
Speaking of doom, Poor Folk doesn't have a happy ending, does it? Varvara chooses Bykov in the end. For security and kind of out of pity for Devushkin.
Heartbreaking choice. Shows the limited options for women back then. Even though she's smart, resourceful, poverty's got her trapped. Feels like she has no choice but to marry this man who's already hurt her.
It's tragic. Poverty robbing you of agency, the ability to choose your own life.
Absolutely. And even Gorshkov, remember him, wins his lawsuit, honor restored, then dies just when things are looking up.
Dostoevsky saying even when justice wins, life can be brutal. No guarantees of happy endings, especially for the poor.
Exactly. And that bleakness, the despair, it leads us to those final letters. Devushkin grappling with losing Varvara and starts questioning God.
This is what I've been waiting for. How does this poor folk story connect to these huge questions about faith?
Well, Devushkin's always been devout, right? Accepted his poverty as God's will. But losing Varvara, it shatters him. He cries out, asking why God allows suffering. Why take away the one good thing in his life?
His whole world is crumbling. Love, purpose, now his faith too. It's almost unbearable.
And this is the early Dostoevsky tackling theodicy. Big word, but it's about why a good God would let bad things happen. This question has haunted thinkers for centuries, and it's one Dostoevsky keeps coming back to.
It's a question we all ask, right? When we face hardship, see suffering, where's God in this? Why doesn't he do something?
Exactly. Dostoevsky doesn't give easy answers, but he makes us confront those questions, feel their weight, that struggle to reconcile faith with the reality of suffering.
Mind blown. Poor Folk seems simple, but it's laying the groundwork for all those philosophical and theological explorations Dostoevsky becomes known for.
You got it. He's planting those seeds of doubt about faith, justice, seeds that grow in his later works.
Incredible how much depth he packs in. But I think it's time for a break. We'll come back and trace those connections to his later works in more detail. Wow, Poor Folk. So much to unpack, right? Social injustice, literary games, the whole problem of suffering. Amazing how much Dostoevsky fit into this one novel.
Yeah, it's remarkable how he takes a simple story and makes it so profound. And like we've been saying, those themes just keep echoing through his later books.
Like a blueprint for his whole career. So before we wrap up, let's connect those dots a bit more. How does Poor Folk foreshadow those masterpieces specifically?
Well, look at Makar Devushkin. He's almost a prototype, for so many Dostoevsky protagonists. That isolated guy, super sensitive, trying to figure out a world that seems cruel and nonsensical.
Right. Always analyzing his feelings, overthinking everything. And other people's suffering really gets to him, like he feels it more intensely.
Exactly. That heightened sensitivity, the painful awareness of injustice. It's a hallmark of Dostoevsky's heroes. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, Brinsmishkin in The Idiot. That intense inner life, that struggle to reconcile their ideals with reality.
Like they're tuned into a different frequency, picking up on things most people miss.
Exactly. And it makes their journey so compelling. We're right there with them, feeling everything.
So, character connections? Check. But what about the big themes? Inequality, charity, questioning God. Those seem central to all of Dostoevsky, not just Poor Folk.
You're right. It's like Poor Folk is where he tests out these ideas. A smaller, contained setting before he expands them into those huge philosophical debates we see later.
A sneak peek into his mind, right? The origins of those obsessions.
Exactly. And even the ending of Poor Folk is telling. It's open, unresolved. We're left feeling uneasy, like the story isn't really over. That resistance to tidy endings, leaving us with questions. That's classic Dostoevsky.
He wants us to keep thinking, wrestling with those questions even after we're done reading.
Absolutely. No easy answers. He wants us in the conversation, grappling with the complexity, just like his characters.
So if we had to boil it down, what's the core message Dostoevsky wants us to take from Poor Folk?
Good question. I think it comes back to empathy.
Empathy for those who are struggling, different from us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Through Devushkin and Varvara, he's saying even ordinary people, the ones we might ignore, they have rich inner lives, complex emotions, real struggles.
Challenging us to look past social status, outward appearances, to see that shared humanity.
Exactly. Cultivate compassion. Listen to those often silenced. Their stories matter just as much as any story of wealth or power.
Powerful stuff. And even though Poor Folk is from way back, its themes still hit home today. Poverty, injustice, searching for meaning in a world that feels meaningless.
Right. And Dostoevsky, with his psychological insights, his honesty, he gives us a way to engage with those issues, to think critically, feel deeply, never lose sight of that connection we all share.
Man, what a ride. So if you want a book that'll stick with you, Dostoevsky's your guy. And Poor Folk, that's the perfect starting point. The novel that kicked off this Incredible journey.
Couldn't have said it better myself.